Hey everybody, this is Eric Trexler, the one and only legitimate, licensed, registered, and certified host of the Iron Culture podcast. And today we have a very special episode for you. This is the worldwide premiere of a brand new podcast called Front Page Fitness, hosted by me and my dear friend Lauren Colenso-Semple. As many of you know, she is a member of the crew over at the Mass Research Review. She is excellent, and I think that the Iron Culture audience is really going to love this new podcast. It's called Front Page Fitness because we are going to be discussing essentially a few topics every episode that are generating some buzz, dominating the headlines, and generally promoting a lot of chatter out on the internet. So whatever seems to be making news in the world of health and fitness, we will be covering on a weekly basis. Now, here's all you need to do. First, sit back and enjoy the show. We think you're really going to love it. Then after that, make sure that you go like, rate, subscribe, and review on the other pages for Front Page Fitness. It is its own standalone podcast. It has its own Spotify page and YouTube page and all that stuff. So wherever you get Iron Culture, go find Front Page Fitness and make sure you subscribe today. Thanks so much and enjoy the show. Hello, everybody. Welcome to the very first episode of Front Page Fitness, a brand new podcast touching on topics related to health and fitness. I am one of your hosts, Eric Trexler. I am joined by my esteemed co-host, the good Dr. Lauren Colenso-Semple. And before we get into today's topics, I want to give a little background about what this show is all about and who the co-hosts of this show really are. So, first of all, the premise of the show here is we don't want to do kind of a generic fitness podcast where we just come in and talk about fitness topic of the day. The premise of the show, if you look at the logo of the show and all the branding around it, it's all very newspaper oriented. And if you're below essentially my age, ask your parents what a newspaper was and they'll explain the concept. It was very gray and dry paper, quite thin pages. But basically you would wait around and in the morning, a 12-year-old kid would throw a paper, hopefully into your front yard. If they were really, really doing a good job, you'd go get it and it would bring you the news of the day. And you'd hear essentially what happened in the world in the last 24 hours, approximately. So the premise of the show here is not just to kind of grab a random fitness topic out of the air and create some kind of hot take about it. What we want to do is actually cover things that are newsworthy, things that are generating a lot of buzz in the health and fitness space, things that are hitting the headlines, and things that people are enthusiastically talking about in the moment. So it's all about kind of talking about the news and updates of what is currently being discussed in the health and fitness world. And we're going to try to keep this show short, snappy, and to the point. So you may have seen my other podcast that I co-host with Eric Helms called Iron Culture. We keep that everything but short and snappy. We do keep it to the point, but we will take you through a 120-minute journey through the latest meta-analysis. That's not what we're doing here because Lauren simply will not allow it. And to the best of my ability, I will try to be concise here. But with that out of the way, let's go ahead and do some introductions. It's good for you to get an idea of who you're going to be hearing from in this show. Of course, first and foremost, we have the esteemed Dr. Lauren Colenso-Semple. So, Lauren, would you mind giving the good people a brief idea of who you are, where you come from, what your background is, and frankly, why anyone should care what you have to say about the goings-on in health and fitness?
So, two things. One, I grew up in an apartment without a yard. So, justice for all those apartment kids. No one ever threw a newspaper in my yard. Someone had to take an elevator up 5 floors and then leave it outside the door.
They put it right outside your door?
They did, yeah.
Wow, pretty good.
Yeah, good service. Also, for anyone who's watching on YouTube, I feel like my hat looks like I'm wearing like a wide brimmed hat because of the back of my chair. And so I just wanted to kind of draw attention to that because
I think you look like an undercover cop. That's what I think your hat looks like. I feel like
We'll see what it is going for.
you're either an undercover cop or you're in witness protection and you really don't trust the protections that have been afforded to you. So you're like, how could I stick out by looking like I'm trying not to stick out? And that is wear a generic, unlabeled black baseball cap.
Right. And, I've committed, so now it is what it is, but it will be mildly distracting to me looking at myself for the rest of the episode.
Yeah.
I am Lauren Colenso-Semple. I'm a former fitness professional. So I was a fitness professional before I was ever a scientist. And what drew me to the exercise science literature, and more specifically the resistance training and muscle physiology literature, was my desire to maximize my own results and those of my clients at the time. But since I decided to go back to grad school and really conduct my own research, I've been focused on female physiology and getting more papers out there with female participants. And I've conducted several studies looking at the intersection of resistance training adaptations and hormones. And, do women need to train differently? Do we need to eat differently, et cetera, to get those great adaptations from exercise?
Awesome. And I know you're too humble, but I will brag on your behalf. Your kind of educational background has brought you through really a who's who list of different laboratories and mentors. So if you've been tapped into the evidence-based fitness world, after Lauren's degree in psychology, she spent some time in Brad Schoenfeld's lab working on some research, then did a master's with Bill Campbell at the University of South Florida. At some point in the mix there, you spent some time over in Andy Galpin's lab out in California. And then your PhD with Stu Phillips at McMaster University, which I personally, in my personal accreditation universe, I don't recognize Canadian universities, but I know people who believe McMaster is actually a fine school. And certainly Stu's lab is known for some of the best protein research in the world. So you have really quite the pedigree when it comes to your academic training. So,
and you've missed my collaborations with you. If we want to tell our origin story, because we have collaborated as well in the scientific space, as well as in the friend space and in the mass space. There's many arenas in which we intersect.
Yeah. Our first collaboration was your master's thesis project. And I was kind of brought in because I've been buddies with Bill and collaborated with Bill, chipped in on the statistics a little bit, and the rest was history.
Which is yet to be published. Sorry.
Yeah, I was going to say, like, you do kind of owe me one on that. So if you could get that on my desk at some point. It's been, what has it been? Probably 7 years?
Yeah.
So if you can get that on my desk within the next 7, then that'll work out, I think.
This feels like a reasonable deadline, but I'll talk to my team.
I feel like 14 years, it is a good runway for a paper.
Science is slow, Trex.
It is. That's true. Yeah, we'll give it 14 to write, 28 to get through peer review, and by the time we retire, it'll be in there. But yeah, and as you alluded to, of course, we both work on the Mass Research Review, which is a monthly publication with written content, audio, video, where we talk about the newest studies in exercise, nutrition, and adjacent related topics. But Lauren, I feel like that's a good overview of who you are and what you're all about. I will briefly give a window into the tragedy that is my life. I went to The Ohio State University for undergrad, studied exercise science. After a short but storied wrestling career, I was told, you have met your quota for concussions. You cannot get any more. So at that point, I said, if I cannot do sport, I will study sport, and I will also do sport adjacent things like bodybuilding and powerlifting. So that's what kept me busy at Ohio State. Got into research, really enjoyed it, pursued that with a master's and PhD at UNC Chapel Hill. And after that, spent 5-ish years kind of bouncing around the fitness industry, doing various things, developed a fitness app, formulated some supplements, wrote a whole bunch of content. And now I am back in the research game. So about a year and a half ago, coming up on 2 years, actually, I accepted a research position here at Duke University, arch nemesis of my alma mater, UNC Chapel Hill. But it's only 9 miles apart, so that was convenient. But I love it here at Duke. And the best way to explain my research, I think, is by talking about what I did today, my role here at Duke. I taught sumo deadlifts to a class of students today. And then I analyzed some gorilla urine, and then I analyzed the urine of a pregnant woman to figure out how many calories they were each burning. So I feel like that's kind of your generic job. You go teach sumo deadlifts, then you analyze some gorilla urine, and before I leave, I need to ship some materials out to a zoo. So that old story, just your generic research and teaching job. It's really fun, but sometimes I look back at my daily schedule and I try to figure out how it makes sense and how I got here. But nonetheless, I love it. And that brings us to what we're doing now, which is Lauren, through Mass and through podcasting, we try to educate the good people about health, fitness, exercise, everything in between. But Lauren, one thing that you didn't mention in your introduction, perhaps you were being a bit too humble. You do have several degrees, and that's fine, but one of the few things you have that I actually acknowledge in my personal accreditation system is that you are a certified wine expert.
I am, and we'll get to that. But before we do, why is it the Ohio State University?
Well, first of all, it is. So it depends on what your definition of is and the are, if we want to get down to the kind of the semantics of it. I don't know exactly when it became a thing. My understanding, which may be false, is that in the original paperwork, they decided to make it the Ohio State University instead of Ohio State University. But then it became like a point of pride for some reason, and really just a point of like narcissism and
well, it sounded like that when you said the Ohio State, like an announcer,
We started leaning into it to try to be as unlikable as possible, and so far it's going really well.
Yeah,
I have to say. But it was some news a few years back when I actually think Ohio State tried to put a trademark on the word "the" in certain use cases and applications, and when you start trying to trademark the word "the," that's when we really reached peak level 100 of hateability. And so now, unfortunately, our most hated days are behind us, and we're on this kind of, we're not what we used to be in terms of frustrating and annoying and hateable.
So you'll have to, as in a university, do something, egregious and or offensive to kind of get it.
Yeah, and of course, you never want to do something that's truly disturbing that actually harms people, which makes it hard. I don't know how we're going to get back to the top of that mountain where we do something that simultaneously harms no one and pisses off everybody. And I feel like trademarking "the" was about as close as we're going to get.
The other point that I do need to belabor before we dive in is you formulated some supplements. So that set off some red flags for me. What supplements are we promoting here? Is this some sort of supplement show? Are we sponsored by your supplements?
We are not at all sponsored by my supplements, and I would consider myself, if you go back into my writing over the years, I might be the most supplement skeptical supplement formulator of all time. I am a nightmare to work with when companies do bring me in to inform their formulations, because I am essentially playing defense. And they say, what if we throw this in? And I say, well, you could, but it wouldn't work. Or, so it's, I do tend to be a supplement skeptic by nature, but I think that there are supplements for which there are very evidence-based use cases. And so I've helped formulate a few little products here and there based on, the literature as I see it. And it's not a huge part of what I do or what I've ever done, just because, well, frankly, I've pretty much formulated every product I could believe in. I basically, I've formulated, I don't know. I forget all the NDAs and stuff that I've signed in my life. I have no idea. So I will save myself the legal headaches of elaborating into each one. But I will give you very straight talk on this podcast about supplements. There are a very small number that are even worth thinking about, and those are the ones that have found their way into the very, very small list of supplements that I've helped formulate. So thank you for calling me out on my immense conflicts of interest and harpooning my credibility with the audience before we even get to our first topic.
That's my job.
Yep.
So alcohol.
I've tried it, not my thing. But I understand that you essentially built your life around it and achieved a certification in it. So what was that all about?
A big alcohol fan, and you're a liar.
Well, no, I've tried it, but I didn't inhale.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
I'm a wine enthusiast, a tequila and mezcal enthusiast as well. And I was recently in Australia. I had some excellent wine. I will say, I'm in Canada. No hate to Canada. Their wine sucks, so I don't drink a lot of wine here. But I do have a certification from the Wine and Spirits Education Trust.
Nice. What goes into achieving that certification, if I may ask?
It's some coursework. A lot of it is the history of wine, different regions, how it's made, how it's categorized, and then there's some tasting involved at the end. But it's not all about the booze. It's more about the education, hence why Wine and Spirit Education Trust.
Yeah.
It's very legitimate, very
Sounds
academic.
Good. In the regional stuff, they didn't get into like the Alberta valley of winemaking.
You know, Canada was skipped in that course now that you mentioned.
Yeah. The best wine comes from the Rocky Mountains. We all know it.
Right.
So there was recently in the news a story that for all the people like yourself pushing poison and encouraging people to drink this filth, this was probably not good for business. So the U.S. Surgeon General called for warnings on alcohol. And basically, there was a whole wave of studies and news stories that were kind of making their way to the forefront, making the headlines. And even some kind of government guideline documents, real thick documents going out and getting publicized that were really casting alcohol in a very negative light. So I was going to say no one ever called alcohol a superfood, but some people got kind of close. You know, back in the day, people used to talk about red wine in a way that was really unique among alcohols. But broadly speaking, there's generally been a thought that drinking a ton of alcohol is not good for you. That's been pretty resolved for a long time. But if you go back 5 or 10 years, maybe even a little bit further, there was what you could call kind of a scientific consensus on light drinking. And the idea was that, of course, heavy drinking is bad for you for like a million different reasons. But there was some evidence to suggest that light drinking was actually a little bit better for you than not drinking at all. There was this idea of what they call a kind of J-shaped curve. I'm going to not use my hands since this is an audio medium, but the idea was that, you know, if we consider 0 drinks, we'll go per day, to be kind of the baseline norm. So that is like your baseline risk level for whatever we're talking about, cardiovascular disease, cancer rates, you name it. 0 is your starting point. And as you go up from 0 to 1 drink per day, your risk of these negative health outcomes actually goes down. So that's an improvement in terms of your health risk. And then as you start going up, 1 to 2 was always debatable, but when you're getting into 3, 4, and beyond, we start to see this very precipitous increase in risk of various negative outcomes that are linked to alcohol, specifically cardiovascular disease and a lot of different cancers. I shouldn't say a lot, but a handful of distinct cancers. So what kind of made the news and was really getting shared a lot all over the place was this idea that we need to revisit that J-shaped curve, and maybe we should eliminate that beginning part that made it all interesting, meaning the safest and healthiest intake of alcohol maybe is actually 0 grams a day, 0 drinks per day. And once you start going beyond 0, we are starting to see some degree of negative health effects, which then, of course, get worse and worse and worse as you go up. So, Lauren, have I at least done a good job summarizing the kind of intro, setting the scene, so to speak, of what was in the headlines and what we need to look into in order to make sense out of this?
Yeah, you're bumming me out. You're saying don't drink anymore.
Correct. So before I get into whether or not you should drink anymore, I think it's worthwhile to discuss some potential issues for why we could theoretically find this J-shaped curve if that J-shaped curve doesn't actually represent reality. And so researchers have done, especially over the last 5 to 10 years, done a really good job revisiting this and saying, okay, we're starting to get a little bit skeptical about this idea that a drink a day is somehow healthier for you than 0 drinks per day. And so they're thinking, what are some things that could cause us to observe this J-shaped relationship if this isn't actually reflective of reality, if there's not actually a causal relationship by which that 1 drink a day is actually making you healthier? And there's a few things that could come to mind. So one thing that is, I think, probably the strongest piece of evidence or the strongest theory, I would say, is there are a good number of people who specifically stop drinking alcohol because they are in poor health. So it's not that their non-drinking causes poor health. It's that their poor health has caused non-drinking because, they had a health scare or continuing health problems. And a physician said, hey, we need to really get serious about your health. And the first thing we're kicking is alcohol. And so in that scenario where there's a meaningful number of people who have stopped drinking because of their poor health, then when you do a survey that says, how much do you drink and what is your health like, you are going to be kind of biasing those results in a way that makes non-drinkers look less healthy than they ought to, if we're just trying to think of the actual cause and effect relationship between how much you drink and how your health is. Okay, so that is one thing that certainly could play a role. Another thing that could play a role is the fact that we've been saying for, I don't know, maybe more, and what would you think, maybe 20 years, it's been kind of generally expected that a little bit of like maybe a glass of red wine a night is actually good for you.
At least, I'd say, maybe 30.
Yeah. And so one of the problems, or one of the challenges, I should say, is once something gets this kind of treatment where it's broadly accepted as a healthy thing, then people who are into their health start doing it. So we call it in some cases, you could call it like a healthy user bias. But if I'm a 30-year-old and I've grown up most of my life being told from reputable outlets, 1 drink a night is actually better for you than 0, then if I'm the type of person who is more physically active because I heard it's good for you and eats, a really healthy, balanced diet because I heard it's good for you, if I'm the kind of person who's regularly going to checkups every year or more frequently, if I'm doing all these different health behaviors and someone said, by the way, there's this wonderful thing called alcohol, beer and wine are both delicious, and spirits, if you're Lauren and you're an expert. But you're like, yeah, I mean, if it's good for me and it's like pretty cool, then yeah, I'm going to throw that in the mix too. So we could also see a situation where these observational studies are being biased by the fact that we've told people who care about their health, you should have a drink every day. And so what we find is that there's this kind of separation between what we're observing in terms of the net, your net overall health and our ability to actually trace it back directly to your drinking habits. We could see some folks who are drinking 0 because they're unwell, and some folks who are drinking 1 to 2 drinks a day because they heard it's good for you. And these people across the board are engaging with their health behaviors to the maximum extent that they can.
Are you speculating on this, or is this true?
I am. These are the types of arguments that come up in some narrative review papers by reputable scientists who have said, we think that we need to dig deeper beyond some of these very baseline cursory analyses of links between how much you drink and what your health is. And in those articles, they provide some degree of evidence kind of supporting these concepts. But with observational research, it can be very, very difficult to actually parse that, because you could look at with this exact example, you could go grab a sample of, 10,000 people, give them a quick survey. Usually the survey is not just like 3 questions about drinking. It's usually a more comprehensive survey about health behaviors. Um, but one of the things that you can rarely do is go back and say, okay, now that I know that you are a 0 drink per day person, why do you drink 0 days per week? Or why do you drink 1 day per week? Is it social, or is it because you heard that it was healthy for you? So basically, to your point, this stuff can get a little bit slippery in the observational research. And the way that researchers typically in observational work try to get past that, or try to work through that, is by having this kind of broad selection of questions on these surveys. And so they're trying to get an idea of not just how much do you drink and what's your current health, but what is your health history? What other health behaviors do you engage in? And what'll happen is they'll say, okay, so we know that people who are into their health, maybe they are drinking 1 drink a week or 1 drink a night because they heard it was good for you. But why don't we go in and control our analysis looking at the relationship between alcohol and cardiovascular disease? And we will account for BMI, and we'll account for how physically active you are, and we'll try to account for your kind of broad dietary pattern to some extent. So they'll try to get in there with these observational analyses, but there is pretty direct evidence that I'll talk about in a minute, indicating that those statistical adjustments or corrections generally tend to be insufficient. It's a very, very blunt instrument for a task that requires a high level of precision.
So to summarize, we've gone from a history of, let's say, a couple decades where people were light drinking for reasons that we're not entirely sure, but maybe health motivated, maybe the fact that they just like to have a glass of wine with dinner. And now that brings us to today and these recent recommendations that say, wait, that 1 drink might be harmful. Is that correct?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And of course, it's never going to be so simple as to say, oh, it turns out everyone drinking 0 drinks per day has a chronic history of health issues, and every person drinking 1 drink per day is a fitness nut who is just doing everything they can to optimize their health. Of course, it's going to be a mixture of things. And most people who drink 1 drink a night are probably going to be folks who are just like, you know what, I like beer, or I like wine. That's going to be most of it. But the question is, to what extent do these situations and scenarios I just mentioned, to what extent might they be distorting the data? And to what extent are the typical tools for statistically adjusting for that, to what extent are those insufficient? And so, as readers of the Mass Research Review will know, I recently wrote an article where I tried to kind of pick out one article that I think did a really good job within a single study, kind of highlighting some of the limitations of what we used to do to answer this question, and also simultaneously showing what we find when we take a more updated approach with some more novel approaches to this observational research. So in that article, I talked about this really cool study where they did the original type of thing, right? So they looked at just questionnaire data in a big old sample of people. They tried to adjust for different lifestyle, behavior, and environment factors. And they did find this kind of, J-shaped curve that I mentioned that goes along with what we've been hearing for 20 years, right? What they did was, at first, they didn't do any adjustments, and they found this J-shaped curve. Then they did their adjustments the best they could, and they found there was still that J-shaped curve, but the, theoretically protective effect of 1 drink a day actually shrunk once they accounted for some of those other lifestyle factors. Again, a little bit of indirect evidence that maybe some of the folks who are drinking one drink a week because they believe it to be healthy, if we try to kind of correct for that by looking at physical activity and some of these other health behaviors, we shrink that apparent health effect, but it doesn't disappear completely. But what they also did was something called Mendelian randomization, where instead of just relying on a bunch of survey data, they actually look for kind of these genetic signatures that they can put together as a composite indicator that essentially shows your likelihood to be a drinker very reliably, while also having this genetic signature that does not also correlate with some of these other confounding variables that might, mess up the analysis and our ability to make these direct links between drinking propensity and the propensity for these adverse health outcomes. And so Mendelian randomization, that's a super brief description of it. It's fairly complicated and you could go into the weeds on it, but it is widely considered to be a really high level way to do this type of analysis, as long as you can confidently identify a very robust and targeted genetic signature, which is the case for this particular research question. And when they did this Mendelian randomization, ultimately what they found was the protective effect of 1, maybe 2 drinks a day at that point had completely vanished. Okay. And so there have been more studies that essentially, when you look at this literature in its totality, the more stringent you get with your methodology, whether it's through Mendelian randomization or other means, the more stringent you get, the more you're able to make that J shape kind of disappear. And, the higher quality of evidence, the less likely you are to find that 1 drink per day or 2 drinks per day actually has any kind of protective effect on health. So after, it's not like this is one study that came out in 2025 and everyone said, whoa, what's going on here? This has been developing over the last 5 or 10 years. People who have been identifying these flaws in prior literature, putting out new studies that are done with a little bit more nuance and some more stringent methodology. And it has reached that tipping point in terms of the scientific consensus where people have said, all right, enough is enough. We are seeing a trend materializing that is a little bit too hard to ignore now. And it brings us to what I would call kind of the updated consensus that really generated a lot of press and a lot of buzz this year, which is that when you do a really, really good job trying to parse out these factors, control for these confounding variables, and you use top of the line, super stringent methods, alcohol doesn't have a protective effect on health. And that is why you're seeing a lot of these government groups and researchers and public health officials and everything in between coming out and saying, it's time to break the bad news that you used to be able to pour your drink of wine for each evening and say, it's time for me to do something for my health and really enjoy it. And now we kind of have to come clean and say, it doesn't really seem like that's actually the case.
So how do we go from it doesn't have a protective effect on health to, there should be more warnings, there should be labels, this is terrible, everyone stop drinking. Like, how do we take that leap? Because those don't seem to be one and the same.
Because nuance is dead, Lauren, and it died a violent, painful death, and it's not coming back.
Sadly.
That is my honest answer.
Yeah.
The reality is, so I gave you the bad news, which is that you used to kind of, not you, Lauren, the proverbial you used to sit down and say, what a lovely treat, a thing I enjoy. I unwind in the evening with a glass of red wine, and it's also good for me. Win, win, win. It's a little more complicated by that, but there's no reason for you to be like, sipping that glass of wine in terror and staring at a warning label saying like, hey, every drop that you drink of this is killing you slowly. Because that's just not what the data say. So when we use these, when the royal you or we use these methods to kind of look at a more rigorous look at the relationship between alcohol and health, it is true that the protective effect vanishes. However, what we find about the relationship between alcohol and these negative health outcomes is that the relationships are extremely non-linear, which basically means if you're having 1 drink a night, probably up even into 2 drinks a night, the effect on your health is pretty negligible. And that kind of depends on body size, for smaller individuals, and generally for females, just based on differences in alcohol metabolism and liver size and things like that. Generally, smaller individuals or females, we tend to say like maybe one drink a night. And Lauren, you'd be the expert. Do you know if that's purely based on body size or if it's like a genuine sex difference? Because they always say
body size.
okay, so because they always say like in the
They do, yeah. The guidelines say for women and for
they
men.
always say 1 drink for women or 2 drink for men. And I was always wondering, because Lauren, as better than anybody, sometimes there are true sex differences, and sometimes they're just like, maybe we should just say that women are half the size of men, which is
Well, also they're like, say smaller people or larger people or
yeah.
for people above a certain body weight. Like, I don't know.
Yeah. So it's probably, I would imagine, a combination of body mass and liver size, which tend to be correlated to some extent. Probably, maybe.
That I don't know.
But either way, they used to say 1 to 2 per night would be healthy. Now I think a very evidence-based reframing of that is that 1 to 2 per night seems, from a health perspective, negligible. And from a fitness perspective, also negligible. There are now multiple randomized controlled trials where they give people either a placebo or 2 drinks a night of alcohol. And over an 8-week period, looking at their changes in performance, body composition, it makes no effect whatsoever. So when it comes to your health, when it comes to your fitness endeavors, a drink or 2 a night seems to be completely negligible. No need for all the panic and warnings and catastrophizing that we've seen in all these headlines. But as is kind of, I wouldn't say always, but as is usually the case, there's at least a granule of truth there, which is that we do need to revise the way we talk about this in public health messaging, but we don't need to go from this is health food to this is pure poison at any dose. What we need to do is have an appreciation for the nonlinearity and understand that light to moderate drinking in that 1 to 2 drinks per night range is probably not going to have a massive effect on your health. Going beyond that almost certainly is going to have a negative effect on your health, and the higher you go, the more negative that's going to be. The one thing I will acknowledge, though, there are a lot of people out there. I feel like it's fair to kind of throw this final caveat out there. There are a lot of people out there who, myself included, unless my demise is brought on by an unforeseen incident that is completely out of left field, I feel like cancer is going to get me. That's kind of, I look around the family tree and I get it. I can take a warning. There's just cancer all over my family tree and not a lot of other health issues. And so for me, it's pretty much, if I had to bet money on it, I'd say car accident, cancer, I would take that over the field. No question.
Interestingly, you were hit by a car and diagnosed with cancer.
Those are actually both true, which is kind of crazy. Those are stories for probably a different day, but it is true. I was, as a pedestrian, struck by a car crossing the street, and I was falsely diagnosed with cancer and was very much, I've certainly believed it coming from a physician. So for 72 hours, I was basically getting my, what's that phrase when you're getting my things in order, for who would be inheriting my net worth of $12 as a grad student.
And your abstract posters from your college.
Yeah, getting my affairs in order. Yeah, all my who would get all those printed out posters of my research. But anyway, it was a false diagnosis, so we push forward. But again, back to the point. It's pretty clear that risk of cancer in my family tree is remarkably elevated for multiple forms of cancer, some of which are linked to alcohol intake. And so I think if you're in those shoes, it makes sense to read this research and say, you know what, for certain cancers, maybe there is, and I say maybe, but there is evidence to suggest that there is a slight increase in the relative risk of developing a select group of cancers, even going from 0 to 1 drinks per day. And so if that is something that is very worrisome to you, it actually is a completely understandable and evidence-based decision to say, I'm going to go ahead and abstain from alcohol except for, maybe special occasions, a drink here or there. But I think you could look at the evidence and say that that is a prudent and defensible choice that is not catastrophizing. It is in line with the evidence. If you are saying, hey, I know I'm at elevated risk of this and I want to do what I can to facilitate risk reduction. But I think definitely for most people, for the average individual, this research is something that shouldn't really cause any panic about the typical drink or two per night.
And have you personally changed your behaviors or plans around alcohol intake? You did mention your own family history, but you also put in an interesting segment in your Mass article that, kind of left some space for the fact that alcohol is really important for, certain cultural and celebratory moments.
Yeah, alcohol is complicated. To answer your question about me, I'm an extremely vain person, and I've been on a medication for a while that causes weight gain, and yeah, that happened. So for me, I've kind of been like avoiding any kind of calories that just aren't really worth it to me. So my alcohol intake has been lower than normal for the last year or so, but it has nothing to do with anything in these headlines. It's just like, hey, brother, you've gained way too much weight and you don't need to be, because my drink of choice is usually like an IPA that tastes like a pine tree, and it's always going to be like 9% alcohol and like 400 calories. So I don't need that in my life right now.
Okay.
But once I get off that medication, lose the weight, I'll probably bring it back in. And I normal circumstances, maybe 2 or 3 drinks a week would be normal for me. And that doesn't really, I don't lose a lot of sleep over that, but I could see why someone with my cancer risk based on familial history might want to just optimize their health. And another thing is some folks who are just health optimizers, like there are people who are really, really into their health and they want to take everything to 100 and optimize everything. And listen, if that's who you are, then alcohol is not bringing you closer to your health and fitness goals if you're really obsessed about kind of optimizing everything. So that's another use case where you could say it makes sense to kind of sit that drink out. But as you alluded to, I try to be really fair in my article and not just litter it with my biases. And part of that was acknowledging that alcohol, when you remove it from your life entirely and take a really dogmatic approach to that, it's not like it's all upside. There are some potential downsides where, you might be removing something from your life that is important to you. Like alcohol, different alcoholic drinks are really important in various cultures. If you're someone who's from an area that just takes pride in the wine they produce, and that's something that you really enjoy is sampling different wines, it's not a negligible cost when you say, I will never drink wine again because of this extremely minimal increase in potential risk of a disease that I probably won't get anyway. And there's also the social element, which is, I mentioned in the article, I got a bit more personal than I usually do in Mass, which is a very like scientific kind of writing style. But I mentioned, like, even if I just anecdotally look back at a lot of, uh, big conversations I've had with friends, memorable, fun, positive stuff with friends, with my wife, with, big business things. Like if you trace back to where they all started, a lot of it was just social drinking. It was having a beer with a friend, or, me and my wife having a glass of wine, watching a sunset over the mountains, meeting up with someone for a beer that years later becomes a really incredible business opportunity. That stuff matters. It's not negligible to kind of say, I'm never going to do anything like that again. Now, do you need to have alcohol to enjoy those moments? Of course not. But it'd be silly to overlook the fact that there is a major social component to alcohol, which, Lauren, I'm sure in your certification they talk about.
Do you think this whole kind of health optimization thing you alluded to is sustainable, or is it a phase that many of us go through?
I would say for most people, it's probably a phase. For other people, it's a marketing tactic. for other people yet. It may be, frankly, venturing into pathological.
Yeah.
Like there are some people who, that they frame it as I'm a health optimizer, but it's actually like, dude, you have like clinically diagnosable phobias related to weight gain and certain foods and lack of exercise. You're kind of hitting these different markers of things that would be kind of venturing into kind of like a psychologically diagnosable compulsion regarding health habits. Now, that's not to dissuade anyone from engaging in a healthy lifestyle, but yeah, I do think, if I'm being honest, a lot of folks who are like really aggressive, over the top about health optimization, for a lot of people, it's a phase. For other people, they immediately pivot it into a social media presence plus business. And you can kind of read, and half of them, they don't actually live the way they're putting out on the internet. It's just
They just
brand.
did a couple of photo shoots and they're reusing this picture.
Yeah, absolutely. And then for others, yet, like I said, it actually could be kind of venturing into what could be essentially a bit of a pathology.
Yeah,
So
I don't know that's something that we should really be, not that you were, but that we should be promoting, because if you optimize everything for your health, then you do end up kind of missing out on certain things, whether it be travel or social activities, or just sort of thinking about other things in your life other than, what you're putting in your body.
yeah, and I would also say, when we talk like the current version, the current flavor of optimizing your health, in my opinion, takes a narrow look at health. It's all biased toward like biological, physiological parameters of health. And I think you could make the argument that a lot of people, as they're pursuing optimization of these like strictly biological aspects of health, they might actually be undermining their overall health and wellness in a way that actually could be reflected in life expectancy, because they are kind of self-selecting in to being socially isolated, being pretty lonely, being pretty worried all the time about stuff. And we know for sure that there's nothing good about being perpetually stressed about things, and a lot of optimizers are. There's definitely a kind of personality type that goes with it, that it's really high on neuroticism. And we definitely know that loneliness and lack of meaningful social engagement is an independent predictor of lifespan. Like it is unhealthy to be socially isolated. And if you insist that you're going to go to bed at 7:30 p.m. every night and never touch a drop of alcohol, and you can't eat food that you didn't prepare in your own kitchen, that's going to end up being very socially isolating.
I was talking to my dad recently, and he's saying, "Oh, some of my friends or relatives, as they age, are being told by their doctors not to drink anymore because they got a blood glucose test and it was higher, or they had their blood pressure taken and it was higher, and the advice was to cut out alcohol." And I said, I wonder if they were just more physically active, or they changed some things in their diet, if cutting out the mild alcohol intake really wouldn't be that big of a deal, especially for, again, like people who, value that one drink per night. So, and all, factoring all of the other benefits of taking a look at your diet and exercise.
Yeah. I do think that sometimes a lot of clinicians view it as kind of the easiest thing to cut. Just like at a very superficial level, you were going to drink that, don't drink that, whereas, like you mentioned, it, like if I were getting older and maybe wasn't as socially engaged as I used to be for any number of reasons, it happens a lot in old age, and my blood pressure was high or my glucose was high. If I were a clinician, which I'm not, although my PhD came from a medical school, so I often refer back to when I was in med school. I would say you're probably better off joining one of those groups that like does a hike on Saturday morning and then grabs a beer afterward.
Right.
Like just the social cohesion, the friendship, the camaraderie, the physical activity, you're more than making up for the beer that happens on the back end. That would be my estimate if I had to guess.
For sure.
All right, Lauren. Now we don't have too much time left, but we have to cover this next topic.
Okay.
And it's really important that I have you here because the main character here is Florida Man.
Love a Florida man.
So you lived in Florida for about 2 years.
Yes.
You now clear this up for me and for everyone listening at home. Florida Man, is this a specific person like Bigfoot, or are there many Florida men?
There are many Florida men. I believe the thing is, if you Google your birthday and Florida Man, then you will find a headline where a Florida man was doing something nuts.
Yeah, and for folks, this may reach an international audience. Who can be sure? Florida Man is hard to describe. It's a phenomenon in America, but pretty much any time you read an outlandish news story where a person is doing something that is so outlandish, so depraved that you have to reread the headline 3 times, you're like, I know what all these words mean. There's no way that they're supposed to be in that order. The perpetrator is always Florida Man. It's always Florida Man does this, and that. And you're like, well, they've done it again. So Florida Man has become essentially a caricature of absolutely irrational, depraved behavior. And that's kind of the origin story of the Florida Man myth.
His Florida Man headline was, Florida man wrestled to the ground by the cops while dressed as Ronald McDonald. Quote, I'm a clown, bitch.
Yeah. And that's a real real thing?
9 hours ago.
Okay. Well, yeah.
Every day.
It's a disgrace to do that to the legacy of Ronald McDonald. So, like I said, completely depraved behavior. I was totally fine with it up until we brought Mr. McDonald into the mix.
Sorry.
But here we go. Florida man on carnivore diet developed cholesterol hands. That is the headline. And what's interesting about this is not just your run-of-the-mill, like, fun little headline. I'll a little look behind the curtain here, some inside baseball. Lauren generally carries most of the weight in terms of finding the headlines we're going to discuss on the show. And when she sends them to me, I expect it to be some wacky little news website, whatever. This came from the Journal of the American Medical Association. This is a very prestigious medical journal. And, of course, there were headlines all over different news websites.
Yeah, to be clear, JAMA didn't use Florida Man in there.
They did not. No, they did not. But the actual, like, when you get back to the source, this was a case report in the Journal of the American Medical Association. A man in his 40s presented with a 3-week history of asymptomatic yellowish nodules on his palms, soles, and elbows. And they have pictures in this case report. And it looks like cholesterol is essentially oozing out of this man's body. Now, it says the patient adopted a carnivore diet approximately 8 months before presentation, before seeking medical intervention. His dietary habits included high intake of fats consisting of, and Lauren, this is where they lost me, 6 to 9 pounds of cheese, sticks of butter, that's plural, sticks with 2 S's, and additional fat incorporated into his daily hamburgers. Now, daily, if you look at the structure of this sentence, daily hamburgers is the vehicle for which we are incorporating additional fat, sticks with 2 S's of butter, and 6 to 9 pounds of cheese. We've talked about this previously. I've gone back into it. There is no way to interpret this other than 6 to 9 pounds of cheese per day. So, Lauren, the first thing I want to ask you is how, why, and also what kind of cheese would you most be likely to be able to consume 6 pounds a day of?
So are we to assume all meals were hamburgers? Like, was he eating the cheese? Presumably he's eating the cheese on the burgers, but 6 to 9 pounds of cheese on burgers, I guess it depends how many burgers you're eating.
Yeah, it's difficult to say because like I mean, I'm not a burger person. I wouldn't claim to have more experience than anyone else, but if you think about, I've had burgers that have little things in them, right? You grind up the meat and maybe you have little chunks of something else in there.
Yeah, you
But
could have cheese in a burger, like
oh,
in the
for sure,
patty itself.
100%. But the mathematics and the geometry of trying to get 6 to 9 pounds of cheese in per day, if you're
Oh,
actually
I have an idea. So you have a burger, there's cheese in the patty, and then you have cheese on top, obviously. And then you have your bun, and then you make a fondue, and then you're dipping your burger into a vat of fondue.
Yeah, and one other thing you could do, I mean that on top of that
Okay.
is, I remember back in the day, I was amazed. This is when I was really in my protein era as a young meathead. Kentucky Fried Chicken used to be called that. Now it's just called KFC. They came out with a food. It was like a sandwich, but the top and bottom bread were actually fried chicken. So it was like fried chicken was the bread, and then there was other meat and stuff in the middle. So maybe he's just using two thick slabs of cheese as the top and bottom bread as well, which could be a pretty
That
substantial
would make
slab of
sense.
cheese.
Yeah, I mean, especially if he's trying to limit his carbohydrates, then maybe you're right. It's cheese buns.
Yeah. But anyway, it's just really difficult to imagine. Like at a certain point, like intellectually, I can understand incorporating these things into a patty, but it feels like to me you'd have to be eating like 31 pounds of ground beef a day to actually physically get these things into the patty and still have anything that resembles a burger. So I'm going to venture to say that this was probably more of a cheese ground beef butter casserole.
Well, I think it's important to note that he mentioned like feeling great and
I'm
that
gonna
he
get
had
there. I'm
lost
gonna get
weight.
there. Yes, he reported, and this is now in the medical literature. He reported weight loss, increased energy, and improved mental clarity. A physical examination, like I said, revealed multiple painless yellowish nodules on his palms and his elbows, and I believe also the soles of his feet. Now, the patient's cholesterol. Now, Lauren, generally you want to keep your cholesterol under 200 milligrams per deciliter. You do not want to exceed 1,000, and that is definitely what
No,
Florida Man did here. So, um, his baseline, they were able to look back at like what is normally this person's cholesterol. It was normally between like 210 and 300, which is elevated. If you're between 200 and like 240, I don't think they usually uh, make too much of a stink about it. But 300 is definitely getting into the point where your physician would be like, hey, we might want to take a look at that, maybe do something about it. But 1,000 is, as you can imagine, completely off the charts. And it makes sense that, basically, I mean, those yellowish nodules are cholesterol rich nodules. That is what they are.
right.
Um, Now, Lauren, we have callously dissected the dietary habits here, maybe a couple chuckles, maybe a little bit of facetious joking around. It is worth noting that that does not make us bad people, because this gentleman is fine. And I looked into it, and I was curious about this symptom of having, these kind of cholesterol-rich nodules showing up on your hands, soles of your feet, elbows, sometimes other places of the body. I was a little curious about like how tightly does that correlate? Is it the case that the moment you see that, it's like, brother, you are having a massive heart attack, and it's happening sooner rather than later? It's actually not that clear of a relationship. Now, it's definitely not good to have your cholesterol over 1,000. There's no question about that. But we do not, in my opinion, in my semi-medical opinion, we do not need to treat this as if we are talking about a dead man walking. And therefore, we do not need to have the gravity of discussing this as if it's a preemptive funeral. So that is me giving us license to joke around about how in the world we would have 6 to 9 pounds of cheese.
It's really just curiosity, you know. So if you're out there, you're a man, send us an email and let's give us the details because there's just not enough details. We want to know what kind of cheese. We want to know.
What is your secret?
Yeah, like how much beef? Were there other snacks involved? Cheese.
This is an artist at work. He has mastered cheese delivery in a way that we've not seen previously.
Yes.
Now, Lauren, I was on the ketogenic diet for a while. I did this way back in the day. That's not an endorsement, but I did try it back many, many years ago, maybe 2013-ish, 2014-ish. I was on it for about 6 to 9 months straight, I think. Not carnivore, but ketogenic. And so I've been there where, you know, you do have a lot of ground beef and maybe you're kind of looking for ways to get some extra fat. You put butter on stuff that people normally don't put butter on. Maybe you incorporate more olive oil. But never in my life have I dared to have the ambition to even approach 6 to 9 pounds of cheese. That truly is a feat. And I am, growing up in Ohio, I am the
Ohio.
Growing up in the Ohio, I'm your salt of the earth Midwestern guy. We like cheese as much as the next person, but we have a delivery system that we call Cheez Whiz. And we take a lot of pride in our cheese products. We have the Kraft Singles. That is probably the number one cheese in the Midwest. Number 2 would be the Cheez Whiz. And then probably third would be fried cheese curds, which is exactly what it sounds like. And is honestly, we need to call this guy and say, hey, if you're trying to get fat and cheese in the mix, you really missed the boat on fried cheese curds. There is a little bit of breading, but I feel like you can make it work. But all of that is to say, if you forced me to try to get to that 6 pound a day quota, even if we're going low end, like you said, it's got to either be fondue or Cheez Whiz. I need to kind of liquefy this cheese in some way just to try to get it down. I don't think I could.
How many cans of Whiz would you need to get to 9 pounds?
Believe it or not, it's been a minute since the last time I bought a big old can of Cheez Whiz. I forget the denominations, but I feel like, especially if you drive up
50 cans of Whiz.
If you drive up toward Wisconsin and go to like a Costco in Wisconsin, I bet you can find like a
one that you can't even hold.
Yeah, you can probably buy it by the barrel, I would think. But no, all of that is to say, folks, listen, there is a moral to the story here. Fad diets are not to be messed with. There are cases where, for brief periods of time, something resembling a carnivore diet may be indicated. Generally speaking, these are in extreme medical scenarios where a trained clinician wants to take you through what they call an elimination diet. And the idea is to kind of strip your diet down to the bare bones if you're having all sorts of symptoms that may be related to food allergies, and they're trying to, or maybe a gastrointestinal chronic pathology, and they're just trying to figure out what foods can we incorporate into your diet on a regular basis that do not exacerbate these very atypical, medical constraints that you're experiencing with food intake. What may happen is they will bring you down to an extremely basic diet that is going to be like pretty bare bones, almost resembles a non-insane carnivore diet. So they're not going to be like, if you go on carnivore diet Instagram, it's crazy out there, Lauren. Have you ever done that? There's people eating raw chicken that they just like got at the grocery store.
No.
Yes, absolutely. Not like that they carefully butchered themselves and they know. No, they're going to
not eating raw chicken under any circumstances.
They're going to the Walmart meat counter and just eating raw chicken breast from it. They're somehow getting all these testicles. I don't know where they're getting the testicles from, but they're eating those raw. There's a lot going on, is what I'm trying to say on carnivore Instagram and Twitter. But generally speaking, an elimination diet is not that. They're just going to bring you down to like some pretty basic, meat and a couple other things to kind of cross off the checklist of your dietary needs, all with foods that are going to be pretty unlikely to trigger any kind of gastrointestinal symptoms or allergic response. But this is a temporary thing, and the sole purpose is to build back up to a more typical looking dietary pattern. testing out different foods that are incorporated slowly. So please don't, if I hear that a meaningful number of this show's listeners are out there having a raw chicken breast and goat testicle stew, I'm going to be really not happy, Lauren. Really not happy.
I want to launch the Front Page Fitness Cheez Whiz Challenge.
That I feel like the first thing that came to mind is like those radio shows that do like a water drinking challenge and then they like kill 3 people. I don't know what the maximum tolerable daily limit of Cheez Whiz is, but
we'll find out.
Probably like 2 ounces. Like this does not strike me as I don't know if it's even necessarily considered a food grade food product. It seems more experimental to me.
I want to see it, so
yeah. Okay, well, how about
this on Instagram?
Okay, the official Front Page Fitness Cheez Whiz Challenge is as follows, and let me know if you agree.
Okay.
This is going to be a retrospective challenge. We want to know what is your PR of Cheez Whiz? Okay. The most you've done previously and lived to tell the tale. Because this is our first episode. We do not have an attorney on retainer yet.
No.
And I don't want to be responsible for a graveyard full of dead people that decided to have 6 to 9 pounds a day of Cheez Whiz.
Fair enough.
Okay. So we'll see how this goes. We'll look at the PRs and then maybe we can set some thresholds for what we want people to aim for. But anyway, moral of the story, folks, be careful out there on Twitter, Instagram, looking at all these fad diets. And there's a million of them. People are going to tell people who know me know that I'm a vegetarian. They're going to think I'm picking on the carnivore diet. I'll throw one at you at the same time. I've seen a lot of people on the internet tell me that all humans need is fruit. Not true. Not the case. Do not try to eat a fruit-only diet. It is not going to go well for you. You are going to be eating what we call an extremely nutrient-deficient diet that is not fit for human consumption. So I'm not just picking on the meat eaters. When your dietary approach involves cutting out almost all the food groups, and there's not a really, really good reason given to you by a registered dietitian or physician, yeah, you got to let go of that. That is not the diet for you.
Well said.
All right. Well, Lauren, that does it for tonight. Folks, thanks so much for listening to episode 1 of Front Page Fitness. We will be back soon with another episode.